The phone buzzed against the kitchen counter at exactly 2 in the afternoon, and when I read the words on the screen, my chest went cold in a way I had never felt before. I'm at a funeral, can't talk, will explain later. I remember staring at those words for a long moment, feeling a strange ache of sympathy for whoever she was mourning, and then, not even 4 minutes later, my phone buzzed again, this time with a notification from social media, a tagged photo, and there she was, my fiancée, laughing in a bright yellow sundress at what was clearly a rooftop party, a cocktail in her hand, sunlight in her hair, surrounded by people I did not recognize, smiling like the world had never held a single sorrow. Before I tell you what happened next, and how this story unfolded into something far more complicated than a simple lie, I want to pause and ask you, if you believe in kindness, in forgiveness, in the strange and stubborn hope that people can grow into better versions of themselves, please take a moment right now to like this video, leave a comment about a time you had to decide between anger and understanding. Share this with someone who needs a reminder that love is often more complicated than it looks, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss the next story from our family of storytellers. Your support means more than you know, because it is what allows us to keep telling these stories, the ones that feel like they could be about any of us, the ones that remind us that behind every text message and every photograph, there is a human being carrying something we cannot see. My name is Grant Whitfield, and at the time all of this happened, I was 34 years old, working as a project manager for a mid-sized construction firm in a quiet suburb outside Denver, the kind of place where the mountains sit on the horizon like a painting that never changes, where neighbors wave from their porches and the local coffee shop knows your order before you say a word. I had been engaged to Marissa Doyle for 8 months, and we had been together for nearly 4 years before that, long enough that I thought I understood the rhythms of her heart, the way she laughed nervously when she was hiding something small, the way her voice dropped an octave when she was truly upset, the way she always answered her phone within 2 rings unless something was wrong. Marissa worked as an event coordinator for a boutique hotel downtown, a job that kept her busy with weddings and corporate retreats and the occasional celebrity appearance that she was contractually forbidden from discussing, and I had always admired how she moved through the world with a kind of effortless warmth. The sort of person who remembered the names of baristas and asked genuine questions about people's lives and meant every word of it. That afternoon, the day the 2 messages collided in my mind like 2 trains meeting on the same track, I was sitting at my desk reviewing blueprints for a community center renovation, a project I had poured 6 months of my life into, when the funeral text arrived. My first reaction was worry, real and immediate, the kind that makes your stomach drop because you assume the worst. You assume someone she loved has died, and I remember typing back, "Oh no, I'm so sorry, who was it? Are you okay? Do you need me to come?" and receiving no response. I assumed she had turned her phone to silent out of respect, as anyone would at a funeral, and I went back to my blueprints, trying to focus, trying to be patient, trying to give her the space that grief requires. It was the photo that broke that patience into pieces. A friend of mine, a coworker named Desmond Achebe, no wait, I need to be careful here, let me simply say a colleague named Desmond Ashford, tapped my shoulder and said, "Hey, isn't that Marissa in Priya's post? Looks like a fun party," and turned his phone toward me, and there she was, radiant, celebratory, dressed for anything but mourning, her arm looped around a woman I vaguely recognized as one of her coworkers, both of them raising their glasses to the camera with the particular joy of people who have no idea their photograph is about to detonate someone else's afternoon. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because I think honesty is the only way a story like this earns its ending. I did not feel rage first. I felt something quieter and more devastating, a kind of hollowing out, as if someone had reached into my chest and scooped out a piece of my trust and left the rest of me to figure out how to keep standing. I excused myself from the office, telling my supervisor I had a family matter, which felt like an ironic thing to say given the circumstances, and I sat in my car in the parking lot for almost 20 minutes without starting the engine, just staring at that photograph, zooming in on her face, trying to find some explanation hidden in the pixels, some clue that would make sense of the gap between her words and her actions. I thought about calling her right then, but some instinct, maybe pride, maybe fear, told me to wait, to see what she would say when she finally called me back, to see whether she would tell the truth or construct something more elaborate to protect whatever this was. She called at 6 that evening, her voice tired in a way that sounded almost convincing, and she said, "I'm so sorry I couldn't talk earlier, it was a really hard day. Aunt Carol's memorial service ran long and then we all went back to the house and it was just emotionally exhausting." I let her finish. I let her describe details, the flowers, the eulogy, the way her cousin had cried during the reading of a poem, and every word she said built a picture so specific, so textured, that for a moment I almost believed her, almost let the photograph become a strange coincidence I could set aside. But I could not set it aside, because I am not built that way, and because the woman I loved had never once given me a reason to catalogue her lies until that day, which meant I had no practice pretending I hadn't noticed. So I asked her, as gently as I could, "Then why did Priya post pictures of you at a rooftop party this afternoon, in a yellow dress, with a drink in your hand?" The silence on the other end of the line lasted only 3 seconds, but I have never experienced 3 seconds that felt longer. What followed was not the explosive confrontation you might expect from a story like this, not shouting, not slammed doors, because Marissa was not the kind of woman who reacted to being caught with aggression. She reacted with something worse, in some ways, a slow, unraveling honesty that came out in pieces over the following days, like a wound that needed to be reopened several times before it could actually begin to heal. She admitted, first, in a whisper, that there was no Aunt Carol, that there had been no funeral, that the rooftop party was a farewell gathering for a coworker named Felicity who was relocating to Portland, and that she had lied about the funeral because she knew I disapproved of how much time and money she had been spending on work social events, especially since we were supposed to be saving for the wedding and for the down payment on a house. She said the words carefully, like a woman stepping onto ice she wasn't sure would hold her weight, and when she finished, she looked at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before, not defiance, not even guilt exactly, but something closer to exhaustion, as if the lie itself had been heavier to carry than the truth would have been. I want you to imagine, for a moment, what it feels like to discover that the person you have built your future around has been quietly managing you, curating a version of herself for your benefit, deciding unilaterally which truths you could handle and which ones needed to be dressed up in funerals and grief to keep the peace. That is a particular kind of loneliness, the loneliness of realizing that intimacy you thought was mutual had actually been one-sided in ways you never noticed, and it made me question everything, every small excuse she had ever given me, every late night at the office, every quick coffee with a client that ran 3 hours long. I did not sleep that night. I lay awake staring at the ceiling of our shared apartment, listening to her breathing beside me, wondering how many other funerals had happened that were never funerals at all, wondering whether the woman sleeping next to me was someone I actually knew or someone I had constructed in my own imagination out of 4 years of selective evidence. The days that followed were quiet in the particular way that precedes either an ending or a beginning, though at the time I could not have told you which one we were approaching. Marissa moved through our apartment like a ghost of herself, apologizing constantly, over-explaining every decision she made, watching me for signs of forgiveness that I was not yet ready to give. I threw myself into work instead, pouring extra hours into the community center project, partly because I genuinely loved the work and partly because it gave me somewhere to put the anger that had nowhere else to go. The project itself, in an irony I did not appreciate until much later, was a renovation of a building that had once housed a youth center in a struggling part of town, a place meant to give teenagers somewhere safe to go after school, somewhere with tutoring programs and basketball courts and a kitchen where volunteers cooked meals for kids who might not otherwise eat dinner. I had been the one to push for the project's approval within our firm, arguing passionately in meetings that some jobs matter more than their profit margins, and my supervisor, a weathered but kind man named Harold Prentice, had finally relented, partly because he trusted my instincts and partly, I think, because he had once been one of those kids himself in a different city, a different decade, but the same kind of hunger for a safe place to land. It was during this stretch of quiet devastation that I met a woman named Odessa Marchetti, who ran the community outreach program that would eventually operate out of the renovated building. Odessa was in her late 50s, with silver hair she wore in a thick braid and the kind of laugh lines that told you she had earned every one of them through both joy and hardship. She had been widowed 12 years earlier when her husband, a firefighter, died responding to a warehouse blaze, and she had spent the years since channeling her grief into building something that mattered, first through grief counseling for other first responder families, and eventually into running community programs for at-risk youth. I met her on a Tuesday morning when she came by the construction site to check on the progress of the kitchen renovation, and something about the calm steadiness in her voice, the way she asked about my life without prying, made me, almost against my will, tell her about the text message and the photograph and the funeral that never happened. Odessa listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she said something I have carried with me ever since, something like, "Grant, betrayal has a way of making us forget that people are usually not lying to hurt us, they're lying because they're afraid of something, and fear makes cowards out of otherwise good people. That doesn't make the lie okay, but it might help you decide what you actually want to do next, because right now it sounds like you're deciding whether to punish her or understand her, and those are two very different roads." I did not have an answer for her that day, but her words settled into me the way water settles into cracked earth, slowly, without announcement, changing the shape of things from beneath the surface. Over the following 2 weeks, Marissa and I existed in a strange, careful orbit around each other, both of us aware that something fundamental had shifted, both of us unsure whether the relationship could survive the shift or whether we were simply prolonging an ending that had already arrived. She began going to therapy, something she had resisted for years despite my gentle encouragement, and she came home from her first session looking raw in a way I recognized, the particular rawness of a person who has just said something out loud for the first time. She told me, haltingly, over dinner one evening, that she had grown up in a household where her father's moods dictated the emotional weather of everyone around him, where her mother had spent decades minimizing bad news to keep the peace, softening truths, delaying disappointments, managing her husband's temper through careful omission, and that Marissa had absorbed this as a survival skill without ever realizing she was doing it. "I didn't even think of it as lying," she said, her voice cracking slightly. "I thought of it as protecting you from being upset. I thought if I just waited for a better time to tell you about the party spending, or found a softer way to bring it up, it would go easier for both of us. I didn't understand that I was actually taking something from you, taking your right to just know the truth and react to it yourself." I remember sitting across from her at our small kitchen table, the same table where we had once mapped out wedding seating charts with genuine excitement, and feeling two conflicting truths at once, that her explanation made a certain aching sense, that I could see the shape of the wound that had made her this way, and also that understanding the wound did not automatically heal the damage it had caused me. I told her this honestly, and she nodded, tears slipping down her face, not in a performative way but in the quiet way of someone finally being seen clearly and finding that being seen is both a relief and a terror. "I'm not asking you to just forgive me because I have a sad story," she said. "I know I have to actually change, not just explain myself. I know that. It would be dishonest of me to tell you that this conversation fixed everything, because relationships are not that simple, and grief and betrayal do not dissolve in a single evening no matter how sincere the apology. What actually happened was slower and messier than that. I moved out for 3 weeks, staying in a rented room above a hardware store owned by an old family friend named Corbin Whitlock, a stubborn, kind-hearted man in his 70s who had known me since I was a boy and who, without ever prying into the details, simply left coffee out for me every morning and let me sit on his back porch in silence for as long as I needed. Those 3 weeks were some of the loneliest of my life, but they were also clarifying in a way I had not expected. I realized, sitting on that porch watching the sun rise over unfamiliar rooftops, that my anger was not actually about the funeral lie itself, not entirely. It was about a deeper fear that I had built my future on an illusion, that the woman I thought I knew was actually a performance designed to keep me comfortable, and that fear needed to be examined honestly rather than simply nursed into resentment. During this same period, the youth center renovation reached a critical stage, and Odessa Marchetti and I found ourselves working closely together, coordinating the final touches on the building, choosing paint colors for the classrooms, arranging donated books for the small library we were building into the corner of the main hall. Odessa had a gift for finding meaning in small labor, for turning the placement of a bookshelf into a conversation about hope, and through her I met several of the teenagers who would eventually use the center, including a sharp, guarded 17-year-old named Trevino Castellanos. who had been in and out of foster placements since he was 9 and who approached every adult in his life with the practiced suspicion of someone who had been disappointed too many times to expect otherwise. Trevino had been assigned to help with some of the light construction work as part of a community service requirement, and I watched him carefully, recognizing something of my own wariness in the way he held himself at a careful distance from everyone around him, waiting to see who would prove trustworthy before he gave anyone the gift of his openness. One afternoon, as we were installing shelving in the reading room, Trevino asked me, out of nowhere, why I looked so tired all the time, and something in his bluntness disarmed me enough that I told him a simplified version of what had happened with Marissa, the lie about the funeral, the photograph, the confusion of loving someone you're not sure you can trust. He listened with more attention than I expected from a teenager, and when I finished, he said something that startled me with its clarity. My mom used to lie about small stuff too, before she left. Not big lies, just little ones, like saying she'd be home by 6 and not showing up till midnight, or saying we had money for stuff we didn't have money for. I used to think the little lies were worse than one big lie, because with a big lie you know where you stand, but with the little ones, you never know which version of the story you're gonna get, so you just stop trusting any of it. I sat with that for a long moment, struck by how precisely a 17-year-old boy had articulated the exact wound I had been struggling to name. It was not the funeral itself that had hurt me, though the lie itself was clearly wrong. It was the accumulated uncertainty, the fear that I would never again know for certain when Marissa was telling me the truth. I brought this realization back with me when Marissa and I met for coffee at the end of my 3rd week away, sitting outside on a bright, cloudless afternoon at a small cafe near the river, the kind of day that made the whole idea of grief and betrayal feel almost absurd against the backdrop of so much ordinary beauty. I told her what Trevino had said, and she absorbed it in silence, nodding slowly, and then she said something that finally began to shift the ground beneath us. "I don't want to be someone who makes you feel like you can't trust anything I say," she said. "I've been in therapy trying to understand why I do this, and it's not enough for me to just apologize and expect you to trust me again automatically. I think what I need to do, if you're willing to let me try, is actually show you, over time, through consistency, not through explanations. I can't argue you into trusting me. I have to earn it back, slowly, and I understand if that's not something you're willing to wait for." I did not give her an answer that day, because I did not yet have one to give, but something had loosened in my chest, some tightness I had been carrying since that photograph first appeared on my phone. Over the following months, what unfolded was not a dramatic reconciliation but a patient, deliberate rebuilding, brick by brick, the way you might restore a building that has been damaged but not destroyed, salvaging what was structurally sound and reinforcing what had been weakened. Marissa began being scrupulously transparent about small things, not out of anxious over-explanation but out of a genuine desire to close the gap that secrecy had created. She told me, unprompted, about spending decisions before I asked. She told me when she was feeling insecure about our relationship rather than performing confidence she didn't feel. She continued attending therapy every week, and eventually asked if I would consider joining her for a few sessions, which I did, sitting in a small office with soft lighting and a kind, unhurried therapist named Priscilla Adeyemi. Wait, I need to be careful with names again. Let me say a therapist named Priscilla Whitmore, who helped both of us untangle the ways our own histories had shaped how we handled conflict and fear. Through those sessions, I came to understand something about myself as well, something I had not fully acknowledged before, which was that my own father had been a man of harsh, unpredictable moods, and that I had learned early to avoid confrontation at almost any cost, which meant that instead of asking Marissa directly about things that worried me, I had often let small resentments accumulate silently until they became larger than they needed to be. Priscilla pointed out, gently, that Marissa's instinct to manage the truth and my instinct to avoid direct confrontation had fit together in a way that had allowed both of our worst habits to flourish unchecked, each of us unconsciously reinforcing the other's fear. This was hard to hear, but it was also, in its own way, a relief, because it meant that the problem was not simply that Marissa was a liar and I was her victim, but that we were two people carrying old wounds who needed to learn new patterns together, which felt like something we could actually work toward rather than a verdict that had already been rendered. The community center opened on a warm Saturday morning in early autumn, the kind of day when the light falls golden and soft across everything it touches, and I remember standing in the doorway of the newly finished building, watching children and teenagers stream in for the ribbon-cutting ceremony, watching Odessa Marchetti stand at the podium with tears in her eyes as she spoke about her late husband and the dream they had once shared of building something like this together. Trevino Castellanos stood near the back of the crowd, arms crossed in his usual guarded posture, but when Odessa mentioned him by name, thanking him for his hard work on the reading room shelves, I saw something shift in his face, a small, reluctant softening, the kind of expression that suggested he was allowing himself, just barely, to believe that some things in his life might actually be good and might actually last. Marissa came to the opening with me that day, standing quietly beside me in a simple blue dress, and at some point during the ceremony, she slipped her hand into mine, and I did not pull away. It was a small gesture, but it meant something larger, because for weeks I had flinched instinctively whenever she reached for me, not out of malice but out of a kind of protective reflex, and the fact that I did not flinch that day told me something important about where we had traveled together. After the ceremony, we walked along the river that ran behind the building, and she told me that she had finally told her father, during a difficult phone call the week before, that his habit of exploding over small disappointments had taught her that honesty was dangerous, and that she was done managing everyone's emotions to keep the peace, including mine. She said it had been one of the hardest conversations of her life, harder even than the day I found the photograph, because it meant confronting the source of the pattern rather than just managing its symptoms. I felt, listening to her, a surge of something that was not quite forgiveness yet but was moving steadily in that direction, something closer to respect for the efforts she was making, the kind of respect that forgiveness needs in order to take root and grow into something durable. If you have made it this far in the story, I want to ask you something honestly, because I think it matters more than any plot twist I could offer you. Has there ever been a moment in your own life when you had to choose between holding on to anger and choosing to understand someone whose actions hurt you? I would love for you to share that moment in the comments below, because these stories only become meaningful when we recognize pieces of our own lives inside them, and there is something healing about knowing that other people have walked similarly difficult roads and found their way through. The months that followed were not without difficulty, because rebuilding trust is rarely a straight line, and there were nights when old fears resurfaced, when I would find myself scrolling back through old text messages looking for inconsistencies, when Marissa would catch herself starting to soften a truth before catching herself and choosing honesty instead, visibly working against the grain of habits she had carried since childhood. But something had fundamentally changed in the architecture of how we related to each other. We began having what we called no-management conversations, a term Marissa coined half-jokingly, where we agreed to simply say the true, uncomfortable thing rather than the polished, protective version of it, even when the true thing was inconvenient or embarrassing. She told me when she felt jealous of my growing friendship with Odessa, rather than letting the feeling curdle into silent resentment. I told her when I felt scared that we were rushing back into wedding planning before we had actually healed, rather than pretending everything was fine because I did not want to disappoint her. These conversations were uncomfortable in the way that physical therapy is uncomfortable after an injury, painful in service of actual healing rather than the false comfort of avoidance. Trevino Castellanos became, in an unexpected way, a small thread connecting the different parts of my life during this period. He started volunteering regularly at the community center once it opened, eventually taking on informal responsibility for organizing the younger kids' homework help sessions, something Odessa told me she had never even had to ask him to do. He simply started showing up and doing it because, in her words, he finally found something worth being consistent for. I ran into him one afternoon in early winter, sitting alone in the reading room after the younger kids had gone home, staring at a stack of college brochures that Odessa had apparently given him, and when I asked him about them, he shrugged in the particular way that teenagers shrug when they are trying to hide how much something matters to them. "I don't know if it's even realistic," he said. "Nobody in my family has gone to college. I don't even know if I'd be able to afford it, or if I'd mess it up somehow." I sat down across from him and told him something that I realized, as I was saying it, applied just as much to my own situation with Marissa as it did to his fear of an uncertain future, that the people who are most afraid of failing are often the ones who care the most about getting it right, and that the fear itself was not evidence that he would fail, it was evidence that this mattered to him deeply, which was actually a kind of strength if he let it be. He looked at me for a long moment, and then, almost shyly, he asked if I would help him fill out an application for a scholarship program he had seen posted on the community center bulletin board, and I said yes without hesitation, feeling a warmth in my chest that had nothing to do with Marissa or our engagement, but everything to do with the strange, expanding way that healing in one part of your life seems to open your capacity for connection in other parts as well. By the time spring arrived, nearly 8 months after that fateful text message about a funeral that never happened, Marissa and I sat down together, not to plan a wedding exactly, but to have an honest conversation about whether we still wanted to build a life together, now that we had both changed so much through the difficulty of the previous year. I remember the conversation taking place on a Sunday morning, sunlight pouring through the kitchen window, coffee cooling untouched between us because neither of us wanted to interrupt the conversation to drink it. Marissa told me that she no longer saw our relationship as something she needed to manage or protect me from, but as a partnership between two people who had chosen, deliberately and with full knowledge of each other's flaws, to keep choosing each other. "I'm not the same person who sent you that text," she said. "I'm not proud of who I was then, but I am proud of who I've become because of how we handled it, and I don't think I would have grown this way if you had just forgiven me immediately without making me actually do the work." I told her that I recognized the same thing in myself, that I had learned to voice my fears and frustrations directly instead of letting them calcify into silent resentment, and that the man who had sat frozen in his car staring at a photograph on his phone 8 months earlier had also grown into someone steadier, someone more capable of sitting with discomfort long enough to actually resolve it rather than either exploding or retreating. We decided, that morning, to move forward with our wedding, not because the year of difficulty had been erased, but because we had built something more durable in its place, a foundation tested by real conflict rather than the fragile hope of a couple who had never had to prove anything to each other. We were married the following autumn, a year and a half after the day the funeral text and the party photographs had first collided in my mind, in a small ceremony held, fittingly, in the courtyard of the very community center we had helped bring to life. Odessa Marchetti stood as one of Marissa's witnesses, tears streaming freely down her face as she had promised they would, and Trevino Castellanos, who had been accepted into a state university on a partial scholarship by then, stood near the back of the small crowd in an ill-fitting but carefully chosen suit, looking, for the first time since I had met him, entirely unguarded, entirely present, allowing himself the simple pleasure of celebrating something good without waiting for it to fall apart. During the reception, held in the same reading room where Trevino had once confessed his fears about college applications, Marissa gave a short, unscripted toast that I will remember for the rest of my life. She talked about the day the lie had unraveled, not shying away from it or softening it for the audience the way she once might have, but naming it directly, telling the story of the fake funeral and the real party with an honesty that made several people in the room laugh through their surprise, and then she said, her voice steady despite the emotion clearly moving through her, "I used to think love meant protecting people from hard truths. I've learned that real love means trusting someone enough to give them the truth and trusting them to handle it, even when it's uncomfortable, even when you're scared of what they might say. Grant taught me that by refusing to let me get away with managing him, and I am a better person because he loved me enough to demand that of me." I felt, listening to her, an overwhelming gratitude not for the absence of pain in our story, but for what the pain had ultimately produced between us, a partnership built not on the illusion of effortless compatibility but on the harder, more valuable foundation of two people who had chosen, again and again, to do the difficult work of actually knowing each other. Before I close this story, I want to ask you to leave a comment below sharing what this story means to you, particularly if you have ever had to decide whether to forgive someone who hurt you, or if you have ever had to do the harder work of earning back trust after breaking it yourself, because I believe there is real healing in naming these experiences out loud within a community that understands. If this story touched your heart even a little, please take a moment to like this video, leave a meaningful comment about the lesson or emotion that stayed with you, share it with someone in your life who might need a reminder that broken trust does not have to mean a broken future, and subscribe to our channel so that you never miss another one of these emotional journeys that our community shares together. Looking back now, from the vantage point of a marriage that has weathered its first real storm and come out stronger for it, I understand that the photograph that once felt like the end of everything was actually the beginning of something far more real than what came before it. Marissa and I still have hard conversations sometimes, still catch ourselves slipping into old patterns under stress, but we no longer fear those moments the way we once did, because we have proof, hard one and specific, that we can move through difficulty together rather than being destroyed by it. Odessa continues to run the community center with the same steady grace she brought to it from the beginning, and last I heard, Trevino calls her every few weeks from college just to talk, something she told me with unmistakable pride in her voice, the pride of someone who has watched a wounded young person learn to trust the world again. As for the yellow sundress Marissa wore in that fateful photograph, she still has it hanging in our closet, and every so often, when we need to remind ourselves of how far we have come, one of us will mention it, not with bitterness anymore, but with something closer to gratitude, the strange, hard-earned gratitude of two people who know exactly what it cost them to build something real, and who would choose, without hesitation, to pay that cost again.